Hey everyone, welcome to another edition of PowerCore Productions and Podcastings, where in today's video we are going to be continuing Naruto, The Tale of Two Sages. What if Naruto was Louise's familiar? Part 5. As always, if you enjoyed today's videos and everything else that we have to offer, then please don't forget to like, comment, subscribe, share, and hit that bell for post notifications so you can stay up to date on everything that is PowerCore Productions and Podcastings that has to come out now and in the future. As we go into part 5 of this series, the one thing I do want to mention is that in the start, we are going through the events of Familiar of Zero, which for those of you who haven't seen this series is a 4-season series, each season consisting of 12 episodes. I normally try to cover 3 episodes per video, so when you do the math, the first portion of this whole story is covering all of the events of the first 4 seasons. After we go through the first 4 seasons, then we will switch back over to the story of Naruto, where the conclusion will take place. So if at some points things might seem like they're going a bit too slow, that's simply because that's the part of the story we're trying to get through, so please keep that in mind going forward. But I've seen a lot of you guys have been enjoying this series, so without further ado, we're going to keep it going with today's video. As always, sit back, relax, and enjoy the show. With the ever-growing tension of the country of Tristan, as it found itself enthralled with war, Naruto was finding it harder and harder to keep himself out of the conflict. For one, as Louise's familiar, he did feel as though he owed it to her to help in any way that he could. But in the meanwhile, he and Jiraiya were still trying to figure out a way back home. This was a lot harder than you might think, primarily because the powers of 2 worlds were now coming into conflict. Naruto had tried multiple reverse summonings in order to get himself back to his own world, all of which had failed. Of course, in the meantime, Naruto was not going to be sitting by twiddling his thumbs. No, he still had training that he could do. After all, Jiraiya wanted Naruto to be prepared for any situation, no matter how long he might be in this world. If everything went as he hoped, they would eventually return home, where his own trials and tribulations would await him. And so, Jiraiya felt that it was time for Naruto to take the next step in his training, that being Sage Mode. However, Naruto would be learning a different version of Sage Mode. For one, Naruto would not be able to learn Toad Sage Mode because he couldn't go to Mount Miyaboku. And also, they couldn't practice with Mount Miyaboku oil because it instantly evaporated the moment that it left from the very foundation of Mount Miyaboku. But Naruto was not left in the dark. There was a version of Sage Mode that he could learn. Although, to say it would be difficult would be an understatement. This version of Sage Mode would be the one used by the first Hokage himself, Hashirama Senju. Before Hashirama had died in this world, he had written down a memoir of his life, as well as the various ninjutsus that he had created and used along the way. Among them, the steps in order to use his version of Sage Mode, Pure Nature, as it was titled. You see, the difference between his Sage Mode and the Sage Mode you might be familiar with others is the fact that this one was not based on an animal motif. It was based solely on puring out one's own chakra, to pull in sage arts from all around you. Of course, this gave Naruto his own set of difficulties, as Jiraiya would soon find out, along with Ma and Pa Toad, who were also summoned to this world to help Naruto with his training. You see, For Naruto, whenever he pulled in too much Sage Chakra, rather than turning into a toad and potentially turning into stone, the tips of Naruto's fingers would start to bloom. They would literally start to grow little buds and flowers, and his skin would start to turn a dark, wrinkly brown as it began to shrivel up and dry like it were that of the bark of a tree. Yes, the penalty for Naruto absorbing too much Sage Chakra now was that he might literally become one with nature. And, in order to offset this, Pa Toad would have to use a special baton. Normally, one good hit on the head would dispel all of the Sage Chakra that someone might absorb within themselves, and thankfully the principle still applied. Only now, whenever Naruto was hit, it was to keep him from turning into a tree. Of course, Jiraiya was definitely impressed with what he was seeing from Naruto. He was making great strides in his power, but not just in that. There was also something else that Naruto had gained. He noticed it when the two of them were sparring one afternoon. Jiraiya attempted to launch a fireball towards Naruto, and Naruto, using his sword Durf, would attempt to slice through the fireball attack. However, to both of their amazements, they were able to see that Naruto, using the sword, was able to absorb the ninjutsu, along with the ruin on his left hand glowing when he did so. Durf would explain that one of his abilities was the absorption of magic, but because of Naruto's biology, not only was magic absorption at his disposal, but also the absorption of chakra. The best way to describe this power, in a rather ironic way, think of the Karma Seal from Boruto and the powers of the Karma. The power of the Karma gives the user the access to a multitude of knowledge in terms of martial arts and various fighting styles from each user of the previous Karma Seal. In a similar way, having the Mark of Gandalf basically allows Naruto to have access to the various fighting forms, the styles, and the techniques of those who also bore the mark that came before him, which, in the world of Familiar of Zero, is unknown just how many there were. But safe to say, this version of Naruto would be much more better as a practitioner of sword fighting and many other skills. Along with the usage of magic/chakra absorption, as well as being able to store and redistribute the power back out, you could say that this version of Naruto has a much more safer, albeit maybe a tad bit weaker, version of Karma before the power would ever even be introduced into the series. And on top of that, Naruto would also be undergoing his Sage Mode training. But there was also another growing problem, and that was how to deal with the power of the Nine Tails. Jiraiya specifically warned Naruto not to tap into the Nine Tails' power while they were here, primarily due to the trouble that it may cause. Of course, Naruto was a bit hesitant. After all, he thought he could control the power just fine. But then he remembered what happened at Tenchi Bridge. He remembered how he had hurt Sakura, and how he had lost control versus Orochimaru. And then Jiraiya had to make him think on a much more worser scale. While Jiraiya was not going to underestimate the power of this world, knowing that it could very well rival or even surpass their own, for the most part, they seemed to be stronger than your average sorcerer. And that was an issue. If Naruto were to lose control of the Nine Tails, and God forbid if the Nine Tails were to actually go on a rampage in this world, there might not be anyone here who could be capable of stopping him if it got to that point. And Naruto could in essence become the downfall of a whole world itself. Taking this into consideration, Naruto would heed Jiraiya's warning, and would try not to tap into the power of the Nine Tails, if he could avoid it. In the meantime, Louise was dealing with her own issues. With help from Naruto, her skill improved. Slowly but surely, day by day, her explosions became less and less of a common occurrence, and she was actually starting to pick up on some of her skills rather decently, such as alchemy. But for Louise, there was also something else. She wasn't entirely sure of why, but she would find herself looking out the window at night, watching Naruto as he trained, tirelessly, almost to the point where he was about to drop and hit the ground. One night in particular, he did so, Louise rushing outside immediately and getting some help to bring him back in. Of course, Naruto was not going to sleep on a pile of hay, and he took to using a chair that he leaned up against the wall. But for tonight, she lied him in bed next to her, as she saw the scars and the bruises that were all over his body, the newer ones and even the older ones that had faded. She could see that his body told a story. She wasn't sure of what he had been through. Just what sort of life had Naruto lived before he come here? And even more so, why did she not want him to leave? This was something that even she herself could not fully answer. Maybe it was because he was a powerful familiar, probably one of the strongest to have ever been summoned, and no one would want to give that up right away. After all, whether if her pride would not let her admit it or not, she had only gotten as far as she had because of Naruto. Naruto was not your typical familiar. He didn't take orders, he didn't back down. It didn't matter what Louise tried to do, no matter how much she tried to hit him or intimidate him, Naruto was always ready to call her out. It was harsh, she didn't always like it. In fact, sometimes she wanted to cry. But at the same time, she couldn't deny the results that came from Naruto's rather harsh treatment. And he could also be just as encouraging. No, this was something different for Louise. And she wasn't entirely sure of where these feelings would lead her. After all, she had seen that Naruto had had eyes for her friend Henrietta, who was now the queen of the country. And sure, Henrietta was a lot more developed than Louise, but even still, there was just something about it, something that was off-putting. Of course, there were various trials and challenges that came from time to time, nothing that would be overly too serious, or nothing that Naruto couldn't solve. For instance, there was the situation with Louise's sisters, that being in her rather strict and rather apparent sort of attitude from one of them, the child who was the second oldest of the three, and the one who were older over Louise, that being in Eleanor, who didn't take too kind to Louise going off and doing her own thing whenever she wanted. But at the same time, even Eleanor could see that Naruto proved to be a very good familiar to have. Although, for the sake of the family, she didn't want things to become indecent, and as such, she would hope that their mother and father would have things arranged so that Louise could be married off properly to a duke or someone of a higher class. Of course, Naruto never took too kindly to the whole talk about the higher class and the lower class, since those type of concepts really didn't matter to him. And neither to their oldest sister, that being Catalia. She was already married, but due to custom and tradition, while Louise would be a quality bride, she could not be married really officially until Eleanor was married. Not that that was necessarily a rule, but it was just the common tradition for sisters to be married from oldest to youngest. And right now, unfortunately, the middle child had already failed 2 engagements. so she was in a bit of an irritated mood to say the least. Of course though, Naruto helped Louise so that that sort of thing didn't get to her. He always wanted Louise to see the bigger picture of things. That it didn't matter how much money you had, or where you came from, or who your parents were, or even what you were. The only thing that mattered was what you made of your own life. Sure, if Louise truly wanted to be the greatest mage of all time, then that was something she would just have to work towards. Or if there was something else that she wanted to do as well, then that too would also be something that she should be able to gain. But no matter what she did, it had to be something that she wanted. If she tried to do it just for the sake of others, then she'd never really stand a chance. But of course, our story was not just revolving around the days and the lives of those of the country of Tristan. We also have another world to discuss. Naruto's world. And to say that things were in a turmoil would be an understatement. It had gotten to the point where the Akatsuki were able to determine that Naruto was not in this world. One of their members, Zetsu, had even been checking and snooping around, and according to his sources, the Nine Tails had simply disappeared. He wasn't necessarily being ruled off as being killed or anything, he was just simply gone, and there was no trace of him anywhere on Earth. To say that everyone was getting antsy would be an understatement. Just what on earth were they supposed to do? The whole point of their plan, the whole reason they put all of this together, was to capture all of the tailed beasts. And now the Nine Tails, the last beast that they had to find, was simply gone. Not even necessarily dead, just gone. And if it wasn't dead, but Naruto really was gone, well, then that just meant that their plans were all but destroyed. Because unless they captured the Nine Tails, then this whole plan was pointless. Everyone was getting irritated. But for now, they would simply keep their eyes and ears focused on everything. And if any news were to come along about the tailed beasts, then they would focus on doing that. In the meanwhile, they would continue to carry on in their missions. The 2 tails, the 3 tails, the 4 tails, the 5 tails, and the 6 tails would all be captured without question. In fact, it would benefit Konoha in this instance, primarily because the Akatsuki wouldn't have their attentions focused on the Hidden Leaf. After all, there was no point in doing so. If Naruto wasn't there, then there was no reason to even bother. Word had even gotten to Sasuke, as he and his team of the Taka were also on the move. A team that was comprised for one reason and one reason alone: for the elimination of Sasuke's older brother, Itachi Uchiha. Even Sasuke was now being briefed by word of mouth that Naruto was nowhere in the world, and even this had piqued his interest. Just what on earth was going on here? Of course, under normal circumstances, Sasuke would have been focused primarily on his brother, but midway through he stopped, as they were in the Land of Fire, before going and continuing their search for Itachi. Sasuke would make a beeline towards Konoha. He wasn't sure of why. He wasn't even sure of what he was looking for. He wasn't sure of what he'd find when he got there, but it couldn't be. Why was Naruto gone? Where on earth was he? Just what was happening? Meanwhile, back with Naruto, for the most part, his training continued on fairly well. Having more time to focus on himself, along with help from Jiraiya, they were able to pick up on a lot of the things that Naruto had missed, such as learning how to add wind chakra to his various arsenal, as well as gaining new wind-style ninjutsu. On top of that, his Sage Mode training was going along fairly well also. Naruto would still come up with the idea of having his clones gather up the sage energy for him, and roughly he'd be able to do just about what he could in the original. Although, because he was a little stronger, it would be a little more different in his favor. Naruto would be able to make up to 8 clones. He would have 4 clones stay back to gather up the Sage Chakra. Of course, for each clone that was undone, that would give Naruto 5 minutes worth of Sage Mode. Meanwhile, the original Naruto, while in Sage Mode, would be able to fight with up to 4 other clones, giving him a grand total of 5 Narutos with nature-style Sage Mode. This was probably Naruto's biggest leaps and bounds when it came to his power, and it wasn't only noticed by just Jiraiya, but by the others around him. Among them being one of the teachers, that being Mr. Colbert. He would speak with Naruto from time to time, along with Jiraiya. He and Jiraiya being kindred spirits in a way. Jiraiya was even privy to learning a little bit of Mr. Colbert's past, even more so than the other students. Of course, eventually, the underground library would be discovered, and Mr. Colbert would want to explore it. With Naruto's help, the two of them would search the undergrounds, but they wouldn't be alone. One thing led to another, and eventually it became a group thing, as Tabata, Louise, Siesta, Crochet, along with Agnes, all of them would go to the underground library and explore together. But while they were there were many truths that would be discovered in the process. Among them, for Agnes, she would learn more about her past, about an incident that occurred almost 20 years ago when she were younger. An incident that resulted in the destruction of her home, the death of her parents, and all of this were done at the hands of magic users. For Naruto, he was now able to understand why she detested magic or any other form of outsourced power. It was the same power that had been used to destroy her life. But Naruto, even for his rather airheadedness, noticed that Agnes's story affected Mr. Colbert the most. At first, he wasn't really sure of why, and trying to understand just what had been going on, although sadly the truth would be revealed. It would occur when, just as Agnes would have predicted, the academy would find itself under attack by a raid of enemy mercenaries, among them being a member of a former battalion, one who went by the name of Binabiro, a master of flame, and one of the few who had personally had a role to play in the destruction of Agnes's home. But what would be even more shocking is what would be learned was that Colbert, someone whom Agnes thought she had remembered and recognized as someone who saved her from the tragedy, it had been him, but he was also a member of that same battalion who attacked her home. An attack that was done solely for the greed of a rather evil individual who wanted the land that her family lived in, the land of her people, and he went through rather nefarious means to do so, bringing false allegations that resulted in her townside's destruction. Of course, hearing this news, Agnes was felt with a strong sense of rage, as she even moved to try to kill Mr. Colbert for his involvement, for what he had done. Of course, Naruto would get in between her. For Naruto, he had come to know Mr. Colbert. He wasn't the monster that Agnes thought he was, although at the same time, Naruto couldn't help but admit that what he had done was wrong. And in the end, Agnes, with her eyes staring in pain, would look to Naruto as she yelled. She yelled at him, asking what right did he have to get involved. He wasn't even from this world. How could he ever understand anything that they'd gone through, anything that she had been through? How would he know what it was like to lose family? Just what on earth would he know about seeing the ones that he loves be killed and butchered and slaughtered for no good reason? Hearing those words, it caused Naruto to stop for a moment and think. He knew someone back home who felt and shared in that same sentiment. Someone that he considered a friend. And now, even more than before, Naruto was not sure of what to say. He wasn't sure of what to do. In the end, he really didn't have an answer. In the midst of the fire and the flames surrounding the academy, Mr. Colbert would usher the students to escape, imploring for Naruto to help them while he stayed back to deal with the enemy, and seemingly in the process, sacrificing himself for others. Of course, when it was all said and done, Naruto would have a heart-to-heart with Jiraiya about the matter. Jiraiya revealing that he and Colbert had spoken in length about their past, and he had actually learned some of what Colbert had been through in the life that he had lived. Of course, Jiraiya understood all too well the situation that Colbert had been in. It was no different than the situation for shinobi in their world. Of course, some may say that just following orders isn't an excuse, but this world was a lot more complicated than many would give it credit. Naruto asked Jiraiya just what on earth he was supposed to do. He had been making friends with people here. He knew that people couldn't be as bad as they seemed to be. He wanted to help them, but at the same time, did he really have a right to? I mean, just what on earth was he supposed to do in these situations? When it came to war, it might seem like one side was right and one side was wrong. But for all he knew, the other side could be just as justified in their fight against Naruto's own friends. In the end, did he really have a right to get involved? A right to really stand on these battlefields? Just as they were speaking, Jiraiya would receive a messenger toad. It would have been sent to where they were at. It was a letter from Tsunade regarding some news that was being filtered in about the potential whereabouts of the leader of the Akatsuki. Seeing this as urgent, Jiraiya would have to return back to their world, although he promised that no matter what, he would see Naruto again. The two of them hugging it out as Jiraiya would reverse summon himself back to Mount Miyaboku, before making his way back to the Hidden Leaf. In the meantime, Naruto would be left on his own, left to ponder these things, and to try to figure out just what on earth he was supposed to do here. Although it wouldn't take long, as soon he would find himself standing before the throne, Henrietta sitting as she had called for both Naruto and Louise. The war had now taken a drastic turn, and it seemed as though if there was going to be any hope of victory, she was going to need all the help that she could get. As she looked back down to the kneeling Naruto, she would ask for him to stand, as she rose from her seat as well. She walked down the stairs before standing before Naruto, as she humbly bowed before him. Many would be shocked, as this was not the actions befitting of a queen. However, Henrietta was not approaching him as a queen, but as a friend in need. As she looked back up to Naruto, she asked for his help, to lend his power to save her country. This concludes What If Naruto Was Louise's Familiar? Naruto The Tale of Two Sages, Part 5. As always, if you enjoyed today's video and everything else that we have to offer, then please don't forget to like, comment, subscribe, share, and hit that bell for post notifications so you can stay up to date on everything that is PowerCore Productions and Podcastings that's to come out now and in the future. Stay tuned for tomorrow's video as we continue My Hero Academia The Dark Knight Returns, What If Deku Was Batman, Part 5. But anyway, that's going to do it for the end of today's video. I'm Javon Harrington with PowerCore Productions and Podcastings. Signing off, and I'll see you next time.